Classpecting is a meta-analytical system used to ascribe and understand story roles that characters fill, what archetypes they draw from, and how they interact with the story itself. It originated in Homestuck as a way to give characters god-tier titles, and while the comic goes into depth with how these titles are used for its own world-building, I believe it can be applied to basically any story. Moreover, I think Classpect can be a valuable tool in understanding and dissecting storytelling as a whole. It's not about character personalities or aesthetics, it's about narrative and a character's self-actualization within the confines of the story. The portmanteau of Classpect comes from the words class and aspect. In this video, I'll be going in depth with the class system, and it will probably be a lot more difficult to follow along with if you haven't seen my previous video about aspects. This is because class titles do very little on their own. A class title essentially describes the way in which a character interacts with their given aspect, how they use or embody the symbols the story assigns to them. They are, in theory and in practice, archetypes that codify modern characters into a set pattern of 14 possible broad tropes that account for the character's motivations, purpose in the story, and the trajectory of their arc, all of course dependent on the character's given aspect, aka their symbolism. I feel the need to stress, though, creating a comprehensive system of archetypes that applies to everything ever is extremely difficult. So difficult that the father of archetypes himself didn't do that either. The universality of archetypes is what makes classes both intuitive and also really hard to define. If we count off time, I basically spent the last, 3 years trying to scramble together a framework that I thought was both simple and extensive enough to make a video about. So I made a corkboard about it. You thought I was joking! This is completely unironic. I need you all to know. I actually went insane over classpecting enough to make a fucking corkboard of all my fucking conspiracy theories. Corkbork. They don't need to know how many times I said corkbork instead of corkboard. The intention behind the implementation of class titles in Homestuck was, allegedly, to have them situated on a sliding scale between two extremes, active or passive. I say allegedly because, in the text, there's nothing that confirms this idea as fact, merely as opinion based on the observations of a very traumatized young person. This dichotomy is what classpect analysis is based on, unfortunately. Optimistic Dualist's framework is the most thorough and popular in this regard, and in my opinion, if you're going to ascribe to the active-passive split, his system is the most reliable, even if messy and not completely in line with what the actual words active and passive mean. On the opposite end, you have writers like O Pacifica, who entirely disregard the idea of activity and passivity as something worth considering, instead analyzing Homestuck's god-tier system more as a way for a living organism to interact with the living cells inside itself. This theory provided a lot of the mythology and terminology that I ended up using for my framework, when combined with the principles Optimistic Dualist used for his own. Passive and active are, allegedly, based on the philosophical ideas around yin and yang, positive and negative energy that balance each other out, actors and reactors. I believe there is a negative truth in that as it pertains to classpecting, but I don't think that all possible archetypes for characters can be whittled down to just how much they move. The base philosophy of yin and yang, from what I understand, isn't meant to categorize people as either force, but rather a combination of both, leaning in one direction or the other, yes, but never without nuance, and always with overlap. The active-passive dichotomy, as presented, always categorizes a class as either falling back a fixed amount or acting out a fixed amount, and I find this an extremely unsatisfying framework to work in. Sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, the idea of acting out is ascribed masculinity, while the idea of falling back is ascribed femininity. Classes that are passive are described as people-oriented, nurturing, and not concerned with their own goals until pushed toward them. Active classes are described as driven, goal-oriented, and selfish in a way that a passive class apparently fundamentally cannot be. This is the same gender essentialism that Homestuck itself criticizes, ascribing traits of nurturing or self-sufficiency to ideas that don't inherently lead to them. With the added caveat that, of course, you have female-locked active classes and male-locked passive classes, both of which also just happen to be villainous archetypes, apparently. The reason these arbitrary splits are even a thought in anyone's head is because what the archetypes are based on, old stories and myths, are themselves sexist. Gender-locked tropes are a byproduct of women being a second class, and that's not universal to the human condition, that's systemic abuse. With that in mind, the very core of my framework is based on disregarding the idea of a passive and active split and entirely doing away with gender-locked archetypes at all. I will be explicitly avoiding the terms active and passive in my framework, even if they could arguably apply to one part of the table, because of the overwhelming gendered baggage these terms have accumulated in classpecting discussions. Using other terms to describe that one nugget of truth within the yin and yang reading is not ignorance to the terminology on my part, it is an active protest. A simple sliding scale just, in general, feels incomplete to me as an understanding of classes. We are trying to categorize people-shaped concepts, and people are complicated and messy. If you take a middlingly active character, are you always going to wind up with either a thief or a page? What about their motivations, their aspirations? Is the only thing that truly matters how much you sit or stand? I think there's more to these systems, just in general, but the human brain likes symmetry, so I'm going to properly start explaining my ideas with the most neat organization of classes and move slowly towards chaos and fluidity. The most important thing to know about a class's interaction with their aspect is, do they use their aspect, or are they their aspect in the eyes of those around them? Do they act as a source of their aspect, or do they wield it like a weapon? Are they the pursued, or are they the pursuer? To be or to hold, the object or the subject, the player is either the will of the aspect given flesh, or their own will is imposed onto the aspect through action. The embodiment classes act as objects that the aspects move, while the operant classes act as hands that themselves move the aspects. Operants will always be defined by their agency first. Embodiments are often defined by their lack of agency. This dichotomy of being pursued or being the pursuer is just one layer of complexity. The fabled verbs assigned to each class that dictate their core interactions with their aspect are what define classes more concretely. As Homestuck would explain it, the princes who destroy aspect or destroy through aspect, for example. In this framework, the aspect is destroyed by the prince, or is destroyed through the bard. The key distinction being that the prince is an agent while the bard is an object, from the perspective of the aspect. To put it into other words, the aspect is an extension of the operant player, rather than the player being an extension of the aspect like it is for the embodiments. Bards and princes are easier to explain, I hope. To destroy an aspect doesn't mean to literally erase it from the story, but rather break that aspect of the story irreparably, leave it damaged and reshaped from what it once was. Present, but different. Broken. For example, a Prince of Time is someone who weaponizes their aspect. They may break the pacing of the story by making it take longer than necessary, or by forcefully skipping otherwise long stretches of time. A Bard of Time, though, is one who essentially invites the destruction of their aspect by being its messenger and avatar. Someone who embodies death in order for that death to be overcome. As we move up the table, the class's interactions with their aspects are going to get progressively less detrimental to the aspect itself. Rogues and thieves steal their aspect, either to become a symbol of it to their peers or to utilize it as a tool for their own needs. This doesn't mean they are the opposite aspect, just that their symbolism is tied to taking the aspect that they are drawn to, like stealing freedom rather than already possessing type bonds. Thieves in specific are defined by a lack of their aspect since it is outside of them, while rogues are always pursued by their aspect, even when they themselves aren't fully aware of it. There's debate on whether the theft of an aspect is physical or metaphorical. I personally think it depends on the aspect. Contracting aspects can be reduced in number, while expansive aspects tend to multiply when stolen, while juggernauts like Hope actually cannot be diminished because their core symbolism is expansion. I also think that thieves are generally speaking more dangerous, more easy to dislike on account of the fact that they weaponize their theft as operants of their aspects. Rogues, on the other hand, are said to essentially steal for others. They steal their aspect and through that become its embodiment for those around them. Heirs and mages equalize their aspect. They are the last of the classes that can be said to diminish their aspect in some way. The aspect isn't just a belief system or a goal, it's a method that is dulled or sharpened as the need arises. This is much more visible with mages because they're operants, but it applies to heirs just as much because they come into their own through the aspect, applying it to themselves. What heirs and mages do is essentially learn to coexist with their aspects. A mage of doom wouldn't reduce the amount of doom they're subjected to, merely recontextualize and shaping the doom at their disposal to the needs of their environment or their internal struggles. Same goes for heirs, with the added caveat that they embody that which they equalize, often inviting others to influence their aspect through them, similarly to how bards do. Mages and heirs are driven towards different outcomes with their aspects, something we'll get into later, but what's most important about them is that they're essentially tasked with the upkeep of their aspect. It's in a constant and stable state and only ever changes, is recontextualized or applied when necessary, ultimately equalized with their environment. Pages and seers are instigators. They plant seeds that spark their aspect either with small actions or huge waves. While pages embody their aspect and unknowingly inspire it in others while still holding huge untapped potential within themselves, seers are doers that use their aspects to lead and strategize, seeking out the aspect to be reshaped by their eager hands. They're both classes that can sway large and foreboding crowds, classes that are defined by their influence on others rather than their aspect's influence on themselves. Some pages and seers thrive while using their aspects, others do not, and it's not based on the individual aspects as much as it's based on how much the author wants to torture them. Maids and knights serve their aspect. They're classes that are bound by duty, and their self-fulfillment depends on that duty being seen through to the end. Maids, you would assume, get the shorter end of the stick, but quite the contrary. In embodying their aspect while also serving it, they're at their best when they act on their own selfish whims that build up to a greater good. This is often why the first time you see a maid, they are at their worst, most downtrodden or most unfulfilled. Their arcs often focus on learning how to serve themselves through serving their aspect. They're pushed into the role of servitude, sometimes outright molded for that role, while knights take up the mantle of duty of their own volition. They view their aspect almost clinically, not integrating it into their identity, and tend to get caught up in masking their pain and insecurity in increasingly worrying ways, building up a dependence on their aspect and their duty that's never quite as fulfilling as they'd want it to be. A knight's journey can end by finding self-worth outside of duty, but just as often it can end with the knight perpetually refusing anything outside of their strict servile role. Sylphs and witches evolve their aspect, either through an outside agent, in the case of witches, or through internal metamorphosis, in the case of sylphs. To evolve means to change the outside parameters and limits of the aspect's domain, essentially, while the core symbology and scope has to stay the same. Think of it like natural selection, but on steroids. Pokemon evolution type thing. Same thing, but in a different package, has a different application. Witches are more proactive in this process, acting as nurturing guardians or caretakers to a creature that embodies their aspect. The witch, then, has to deliberately reshape that which they cultivated, their narratives often being split between two clear paths: gain control of your aspect, or be forever controlled by it. In contrast, sylphs have it a bit simpler, as embodiments, their evolution of their aspect is often an evolution of the self, or rather, an irreversible change of who or what they are at the behest of the aspect's will. Unlike heirs and maids, and similarly to pages, a sylph's embodiment of their aspects is inherently selfless rather than selfish. They essentially provide channels for other people to access their aspect through, hence why sylphs are also often healers or calming and nurturing allies. Lastly, and most jarringly, we have muses and lords, the classes that command their aspect. Unlike the classes we've discussed so far, that are often beholden to aspects of a story that are far greater in sheer scope than they as individuals are, muses and lords flip that script and become bigger than any single piece of the narrative. They literally control an aspect like it were a limb, either by wielding it like a club or by allowing themselves to become something much bigger than a person. Sometimes both. Each of the verbs we've discussed is at the disposal of a lord or muse. These classes are extremely rare because nearly godlike entities are themselves extremely rare in stories. The main difference between these two is pure praxis. Muses tend to fall back, while lords seek to take the reins. This is the only context where the active and passive dichotomy is actually truly applicable. This isn't where it ends, though. Some seasoned classpectors might have already been decrying my separation of certain classes and pairing of others. This is where the framework gets juicy.
That's right, a square hole.
It's important to separate the motivation of the classes, what actually drives them towards the completion of the narrative quests, because princes and bards don't destroy for the same reasons. Where a prince destroys in order to mold, a bard destroys in order to understand, breaking something to reshape it versus breaking something to see what's inside. Each square encompasses a specific goal a class has towards their aspect, whether consciously or subconsciously. Maids, heirs, princes, and witches seek to reinvent their aspects. Seers, mages, bards, and thieves seek to understand through their aspects, while pages, knights, rogues, and sylphs tend to preserve through their aspects. Yes, sylphs both evolve and preserve their aspect, either in the sense of giving in to change only when necessary to preserve the aspect's integrity in different circumstances, or as an internal intentional contradiction. The aspect evolves through the sylph, while the sylph seeks to preserve themselves, their loved ones, anything they can hold on to for dear life really, through their aspect. A start-stop kind of movement, in contrast to witches who seek change both as a means and as the goal. This is necessary to highlight because a character's goal with their aspect has to be considered when looking at their interaction with their aspect, and I think these three squares get to the core of what most characters pursue in story. The setup essentially fuels a perpetual cycle of defining and redefining aspects, perpetuating, learning, changing, with the secret fourth category holding dominion outside of this cycle, ruling. Lords and Muses may not form a square, but I have a sneaking suspicion that they could. The titles are rare because the aspirations they hold are dominion over dominion itself, to exert control on aspects and people as a whole rather than work within the given system they're part of. In the basic three squares though, we can draw some interesting parallels and connections between the classes on the edges. For example, maids and witches are tied to domestic magic, things you think you understand through exposure alone, but that are redefined by these classes' mastery over their aspects. Witches and princes tend to have a better grasp of the bigger picture, which tends to isolate them from their peers and immediate surroundings. Princes and heirs are both tied to the idea of a lineage, inheriting social status and narrative importance rather than earning it through any specific deed or trait. Heirs and maids are often under an influence, directing their actions and quests until they grow into their own and reclaim their agency. On to the next square. Seers and bards are unreachable. They're often eccentric or just plain difficult to understand at all, and changing their mind is akin to trying to move a mountain. The two of us are a great example of that, actually. Bards and thieves are loose cannons, governed by internal principles that are never properly externalized. Thieves and mages have social roles pushed onto them that, while they can fulfill, they need to disregard in order to fully mature. Mages and seers are textbook scholars. They learn and intuit, and that honed craft is what defines their power scaling in the story, often getting them deified as prophets rather than just magic. But wait, that's not all. Knights and pages often lie about themselves, either to themselves or trying to save face and present themselves a certain way for the other people around them. Their perceived image means a lot to them. Pages and sylphs are really fucking weird when paired together. Sylphs have a natural inclination to help those around them, while pages have a natural affinity for seeming helpless. When you have a page and a sylph in the same room, they'll often gravitate towards each other, often as something akin to a caretaker and a patient. Sylphs and rogues are both group-oriented and often value community over the individual. Knights and rogues are essentially called to by their aspect, sought out for their individual capabilities by forces outside their control, compelled towards their aspect in ways other classes aren't. Are we nice and jazzed up on parallels that aren't part of a neat dichotomy? Are we all stretched and used to the idea that a duality-based system is inherently limiting to the true scope and mythos of each archetype? Good, because here comes the fucking cone. Listen, it was either this or the myth web. You can thank Techie for the fact that this actually looks somewhat presentable, as well as for the flowers in the shot. This table is wholly built on the parallels between the classes that transcend their relationship to aspects. Coincidentally, these relationships also go outside the parameters already established in the squares and pairs, but they have a similar vibe to the similarities we drew between each class on the square's edges. Essentially, while class titles are inherently tied to their interaction with one's aspect, they're also inextricably human titles, and therefore multifaceted. There are parts of myths that aren't tied to story, but rather to social perception and self-orientation. Parts of a title that aren't there in the whole cold hard tables of yore, but are more fluid in nature because humans are fluid in nature. The cone is organized into 4 distinct groups, and each has one more title than the previous one, creating a shape that resembles an unpointed triangle, or a cone. The connection between muses and lords should be clear by now, and they're the starting example because what's unique about them, that has nothing to do with their relationship to their aspects, is that they're often godlike figures, either literally leagues more powerful than the people around them, or deified in such a way that they appear godlike. In complete opposition to lords and muses, pages and mages are fucking hated by the narrative. You will not find a single page or a single mage that wasn't done dirty by the plot or the metatext in at least one way. They're often defined by not being able to fulfill their truest potential by the time the story wraps up. Mages and rogues, though, add mystique. They both add a certain level of charm or the air of unreachability to things that are otherwise ordinary and aren't all that unique. Maids and sylphs are meddlers. They like getting into people's business. Heirs and bards are jokesters and clowns, typically either seeming unserious or naturally disarming people. Bards and sylphs are both extremely volatile, being dormant classes for much longer than any other, then doing a single earth-shattering action often fueled by internal unrest, only to go right back to sitting and doing very little. In the last column, the longest column, knights and seers are goal-oriented to the point of neglecting themselves. Seers and witches often act as wise guides to the people around them, while witches and thieves are often socially outcast and have only a few people they like and are actually liked by. Thieves and princes, though, are interesting because they're both villainous archetypes. They fall into a similar category of hoarders, they just differ on where they are in the social ladder in a given group. The villainous bourgeoisie versus the villainous underclass. Moreover, this accursed cone might shed more light on class mimicry as a concept. Class mimicry is optimistic dualist theory that someone of one class might essentially mask as another as part of their growth and learning process, an expectation to be one way when you're really another, choosing to emulate someone in order to fulfill a role you want rather than the role you're good at or made for. I've observed it outside of Homestuck too, and that's why I'm so attached to it as an analytical tool. Ellen, the reason I bring it up now is because I think the distance of certain titles makes mimicry more or less explosive. Like, at its core, class mimicry isn't a good thing. It's a stifling of the true self through trying to pretend you're something you're not. The speed and intensity at which class mimicry blows up in someone's face, though, I think is based on how connected the two classes are. Are they part of the same group in the cone? Are they part of the same square, the same pair? You're probably safe for a while, though it will backfire eventually. Meanwhile, class mimicry of a class you have nothing to do with in any part of the framework is volatile, reckless, and potentially only destructive. As an example, a prince mimicking a knight isn't productive for anyone in the long run, but a thief... Where's my thief? A thief mimicking a sylph for long enough is going to result in several people traumatized and at least one person dead. The cone is ugly, just objectively, but it adds a little more to the discussion around classes that I think has to be put somewhere. The similarities exist, and I don't want to sweep them under the rug for the sake of convenience. If you only want to use the cone for the sake of class mimicry analysis, here's a version of it that has lines running between all the titles that are connected in other parts of my framework. Yeah, this is ugly too. So if two titles have no lines running between them, you know you're fucked. It's even worse than the normal one, dear God help us. I'm not going to sit and pretend my framework is perfect. Unlike my aspect system and that goddamn wheel I'm married to, it took a lot longer to develop this class theory because classes are, in general, a lot more difficult for me to wrap my head around. The process was very, very messy, and my system is admittedly more complicated and therefore less immediately usable, unlike optimistic dualists' very simple framing of classes. Think of it like the difference between formatting a USB stick to install a Linux distro on it, versus just buying a computer that already has Windows on it. Depending on your needs with the machine, the simpler solution might be best, but I'm personally a sucker for DIY and prefer a broader and more complicated system if it allows for more precision and specificity, which I think my framework does. This specificity also lets me see very visible gaps in my own understanding of things. As previously mentioned, each of the squares is its own thing, but Lords and Muses fall out of this mechanism. I'm tempted to speculate I'm missing two titles. But with Lords and Muses being so rare in stories, who's to say there aren't two more rare roles that we don't have titles for yet? What comes to mind first is someone like Doc Scratch, who acts as an extension of Lord English, yes, but himself isn't a lord or a muse, yet holds ruler-like dominion over the entire aspect of time. My placeholder name for this potential class has been Architect, but I don't know how I feel about that yet. Waste is another potential name for an unidentified ruler class, based on Hussey's shitpost title for himself, but it's not really easy to define and I don't want to take a joke title too seriously. Moreover, the cone is very stacked on one side and empty on the other. This is half by my design and half out of necessity. Previous iterations of this visual aid looked just as asymmetrical. It makes me think there might be a few more classes than the base 12 to round out this roster and add some more meat to the embody and operate table. However, if that were the case, the squares would require reworking, either adding more titles to existing groups or forming entirely new groups, both of which seem like messy and overzealous options. Until I come across a character who doesn't fit neatly into the 12 title mold or the Muse-Lord dichotomy, I'm afraid I'll have to maintain that this is the best I can do, at least for my own understanding. I hope this video was enlightening and not a huge headache. As I already said, classes are kind of a tougher nut to crack than aspects are, and developing this theory was a tall task that used up a lot of Papal. The papacy! I used up a lot of the papacy in order to form this fucking theory! As I already said, classes are kind of a tougher nut to crack than aspects are, and developing this theory was a tall task that used up a lot of paper, a lot of brain cells, and a lot of my employed sister's fleeting free time. This also isn't it, though. I'm making another video to complete this trilogy where I properly go into depth with my process for classpecting, essentially giving pointers on how someone new to this form of analysis can start, what are some clear tells to look out for, what baseline questions to ask, and how to test your hypothesis against other options. See you then! I keep fiddling with this, I feel like I'm gonna break it.
Don't.
We went through so much trouble for this
Yeah.
thing. You guys have no idea what fucking adventure it took to get this little pen, pointy, sticky thingy. It was so good. I love it. In complete opposition to Muse and Lords is... Did I just say Muse and Lords is?
Yeah.
Seers and witches often act as wise guys. Wise guys.
Wide guys.
Wise guys.